Kia ora koutou katoa. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of a period of winter recess. Today I have some news about an upcoming APEC leaders meeting and also an update on vaccines and also just formalising the indications we've already made around quarantine-free travel with Queensland. Let me first give you an overview of the coming week. Tomorrow I'll be in the Manawatu, opening stage 2 of a social housing development in Palmerston North, and then I'll be visiting Linton Army Camp with Minister Hinare. On Wednesday I'll be back in Wellington, where I'll speak to the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs and attend the Te Arawa River Iwi Trust Crown Accord Ministerial Forum. I'll also be holding bilateral meetings with the Prime Ministers of Papua New Guinea and Canada in my capacity as the chair of APEC. On Thursday, I travel to Blenheim for a series of visits and to speak at the local Government New Zealand conference about our 3 water reforms. Finally, late on Friday, I return to Wellington, where in the early hours of Saturday morning, I'll chair a virtual meeting of APEC leaders on July 16, focused on COVID-19. This is the first time in APEC's history that leaders have held an unscheduled meeting, and it reflects our desire to navigate together the path through the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis. Our region has already responded in significant ways, including removing barriers to the efficient distribution of vaccines and related goods. But there is still a lot of work to do to get through the crisis. Leaders will share information so we can continue to build on our collective understanding of the region's health response to COVID-19 and shape a collaborative economic response. Containing COVID-19 through rapid, safe and effective vaccination, micro and macroeconomic policy settings to sustain businesses and workers, and building more resilient, inclusive and sustainable economies will all be on the agenda. I'll be inviting discussion on immediate measures to achieve more coordinated regional action to assist recovery, as well as steps that will support inclusive and sustainable growth over the long term. We have had confirmation from US President Biden, Russian President Putin, and the majority of other APEC leaders who will be attending in person. Now to today's announcement. We are further strengthening our border defences against COVID-19 by broadening the range of border workers covered by a health order that requires them to be vaccinated. The current border order covers workers in our MIQ facilities, some cabin crew, and government officials at affected airports and affected ports. The vaccination of MIQ workers has been successful to date, with latest figures indicating all of the 4,332 MIQ workers on site for the week ending 4 July were vaccinated. No unvaccinated worker can enter an MIQ facility. This workforce being vaccinated has played a key part in our border defence system. But with new variants like Delta on the rise globally, we need to make sure we are always adjusting our settings to ensure we keep the virus out. Recent events have shown us that stronger measures are necessary to keep COVID-19 out, and also we've had a period of time now where those who are outside government employment have had an opportunity to be vaccinated, and now we believe we need to move to respond to those areas where we have not seen the uptake we've required. So we are extending the health order to a wider group of workers at our airports, naval ports and border who are at the greatest risk of exposure to COVID-19. The COVID-19 Public Health Response Vaccinations Amendment Order 2021 will make it compulsory for more port and border workers to be vaccinated, comes into effect at 11:59 p.m. on 14 July 2021 and includes a reasonable window for vaccinations to happen. Alongside the MIQ and MIF workers already covered, the following groups will now be included: airside area of affected airports and some higher risk work at airports, affected ports, accommodation services where specified aircrew members are self-isolating. It also includes work that involves handling affected items removed from ships, aircraft, or MIQs or MIFs, or in places where the employee works for a company that is routinely engaged to provide services for an aircraft, ship, MIQ or MIF, and has contact with people who belong to different groups in the order, so those, for instance, who may work airside. All government employees covered by the order must have had their first dose by 26 August. Privately employed border workers must have had their first dose by 30 September. New workers covered by the order, regardless of employer, will need to have their first dose before starting work. Border workers who remain unvaccinated after the requirements come into effect will need to discuss options with their employer, as they will not be able to continue working in a high-risk border environment until they are vaccinated. I'll just hand over to Minister Hipkins now to give you a bit of a sense of what the numbers will look like for these affected groups. Then I'll make some final quick comments before opening for questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We have across our border worker testing register, we have about 30,000 people. However, not all of those are currently active. Of the people who are active, we have vaccination of about 83% of them fully vaccinated. A further 3% have had at least one dose. In terms of the workers covered by this particular order, it covers around potentially 5,000 people, whether they are active or not active. About 1,800 of those are active in the border worker testing register, which means that they would be covered. The balance of that group will only be covered if they go back to work at the border, and many of them won't. Around 1,400 of those 1,800 are air and maritime border workers, and then the rest are inactive. So inactive means that they haven't worked for more than 2 weeks, and therefore they're no longer on the regular testing cycles.
Obviously, we see different rates where we'll be needing to vaccinate, and particularly a bit of a prevalence at our ports where we do need to lift those vaccination rates, and this order will help us make sure that we have more extensive coverage for a wider group of people. I'll give you a quick update on the resumption of the green zone flights with Queensland. You will have seen a statement today confirming that officials from the Ministry of Health have confirmed the health risk from Queensland is now low, and that quarantine-free travel from Queensland to New Zealand can resume from 11:59 p.m. tonight. And of course, that still includes with pre-departure testing. That was a decision that Minister Hipkins gave an indication of on Friday. You'll recall when he gave statements around travel with New South Wales, and we're now confirming that that pause can lift from Queensland. Before we conclude, I thought I would expand briefly on the comments I made this morning on our work around Reconnecting New Zealand. This work began earlier this year, and many of you will recall that I've set out our initial work in this space on 2 occasions, most recently in a pre-budget speech to Business New Zealand. Given the amount of evidence and research that's continually emerging, we will continue to update these broad plans regularly. Recently, we asked our Public Health Advisory Group, led by Professor David Skegg, to support our next update with a particular focus on requirements for travellers at our borders. We very recently received a first cut of that advice. We've asked some additional questions, but are preparing to share that advice in a public forum, including presentations from our advisory group in roughly 4 weeks' time. I'll look to provide you with further details on that event as it takes shape over the coming days and over the course of the next week. Happy to take questions. Jessica.
Prime Minister, the border is meant to be our first line of defence. The border workers have had access since since February, I should say. Why hasn't the government acted before now?
So keep in mind, of course, our core border workforce, those particularly who are engaging with those who are isolating at our managed isolation facilities, and those core government employees who work, for instance, at our airports, have been covered. We are now going out to the next tier of workers because some of those will be privately employed. Our view is that the uptake amongst that group hasn't been as high as we need to give those assurances, and so now we're taking the step of placing an order upon them.
Taken so long, though?
It is an extraordinary step to mandate and to tell someone who may, for instance, be employed by a private sector employer that they will not be able to work in their job unless they're vaccinated. That is a very big step. So enough time has been given now for that to be voluntarily taken up. We're looking at the numbers. Our view is that we need that uptake to be higher. So now we have taken an extraordinary step of mandating vaccine for that group.
Such a long lead-in time. Why do they have till September 30th to get that first? There's like 700,000 expected to arrive, vaccine doses in the next 2 weeks, correct? And
It's
then
not an issue of doses.
Look, it's not an issue of having vaccine availability. You've got to bear in mind that people working at the borders sometimes work quite irregular shift patterns, so you have to allow for that. And a variety of other logistical considerations. We don't want to find that our ports, for example, suddenly have to stop operating for a period just because they're technically unable to comply with the requirements. So yes, there is a long lead time, but of course we'll be encouraged. Those are the maximum timeframes. We'll be working as hard as we can with them to get them to take up that opportunity at the first available chance.
Keeping in mind for some of the smaller operators, for instance, some of our smaller ports, there may be people in key roles that this will affect that will have a significant knock-on effect if that particular worker chooses not to be vaccinated. So we have to allow the time for those workforces to readjust if that is what is required.
Months before the Wales.
I wouldn't want to, at this stage, put a date on when we would likely see a pause lift. Obviously, we believe the delay will be long enough to justify bringing New Zealanders back for a period of managed isolation within our facilities. So that's an indication that we think that there is a significant road to travel. When you think about the fact that they've had 112 cases today, and New Zealand at its peak had, my recollection is, in the order of 89. It is a significant outbreak, which is why we're preparing for the longer haul.
How long will it take to get all 2,000 or so New Zealanders home?
We're not entirely clear at this stage how significant demand for travel is. On the one hand, it may be that because New Zealanders now know there's a period of quarantine required, that demand may drop. It may also be that New Zealanders take that as a sign that the pause may be lengthy and we may see demand increase. We'll be looking to see what airlines are recording in terms of demand over the next week, but we are working very hard to provide the facilities to bring as many people within our contingency as home as possible.
The bubbles. Why is the Viking Bay vessel being docked in Wellington?
I don't know exactly why they chose Wellington. I mean, they chose Wellington because it was logistically possible. They could, well, I suppose I'm answering the question really. But there was a logistically feasible way of bringing the vessel into Wellington, keeping the crew separate, providing managed isolation for them, and meeting all of the maritime requirements.
To the public being managed?
There will be no contact with the public. It's being brought into a part of the port where it can be fenced off and kept separate, and Wellingtonians may notice a bit of extra fencing on that particular part of the port today. There are a few crew who have to stay on board because under maritime law you can't just leave a boat floating there empty, and we'll be managing that with them, making sure that they're kept safe and that they're kept secure, and the rest of the crew will be in managed isolation.
And it poses zero risk to Wellington public?
No, there's no additional risk to the Wellington public.
Yeah, and you keep in mind that, of course, everyone that comes in on a flight from overseas, we treat as if they may have COVID-19. So, our authorities do have experience with having to move people around who may be considered a risk. So very careful about, of course, as the Minister said, perimeter fencing, infection controls, and movement into a managed isolation facility.
On pre-departure tests from Australia, more than 50 people have now been caught without a pre-departure test when they arrive in New Zealand. Are you looking at upping the ASD amount that you're sampling and checking? You're checking about 50% on Friday. And B, have any prosecutions or fines been levied?
The first and most immediate consequence for those people is that they spend 2 weeks in managed isolation and they have to pay for that. So that's not an insubstantial financial burden that gets placed upon them. We are, of course, looking very closely at that. I will be looking over the next few months just at the overall adequacy of the fees regime that's allowed for, or infringement regime, I should say, that's allowed for under the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. So we'll keep that under review. Yes, we are looking at ways that we can continue to strengthen the amount of checking that happens. That's included sending more people from New Zealand to the Australian airports to be doing more checking based over there.
Do you have 100% checked on that side, so that you wouldn't have to, put at risk people who are on the planes over?
In a perfect world, of course, you'd check everything, but we also just have to bear in mind that we do want to allow people to come back to New Zealand, and we work very closely with the airports. Of course, every minute extra per passenger potentially adds quite a significant amount of time in terms of processing a particular plane. So we work with them to keep it to the minimum of what's required. But yes, public health is the key driver for us here.
The other message I'd make is that checks in this regard will only increase.
Yeah.
So we have to, I think, start building into our systems at the border the likelihood that we will have health checks for a long time to come. And so this will increasingly be built into our systems at the border. And what I'd also say is that, of course, as part of our checks, we're asking people whether they have fulfilled their requirements and completed health declarations. So my message to anyone, if you try and travel to New Zealand without having a pre-departure test, you run the risk of going into managed isolation for 14 days and paying for it. That is not the holiday you would expect.
I'm going to say, did this funding application around meth and the Muggle mob or someone associated with the Muggle mob, did it come across your desk at all?
So all proceeds of crime funding decisions go through a group of ministers. And a point I'll make on this particular program, this program is based on a program that has been that was run back in 2010 as part of the then national government's methamphetamine action plan. And it is very much focused on trying to address meth addiction and the crime that often results from meth addiction. So this, I'd say, is an example of where this kind of program has happened before. It is not new, and it would be a shame to see a political party who once supported addressing meth addiction and crime-related meth addiction from stepping away from that, as appears to now be the case. The second point I'd make is, this is a program that has run for a short period back in 2020, and the outcomes of that suggested higher compliance with court orders. It suggested that people were passing their drug tests, and it showed signs of success. And we either have to make a decision in New Zealand, we either want to fund programs that, yes, will have people involved in them who have a criminal history, but we are determined to address their methamphetamine addiction, or we exclude people with criminal histories from meth programs. I, for one, want to stop victimisation, and so that means that we will be offering programs to people who have a criminal past.
You're one of the ministers.
I am one of the ministers, and well, also I'm comfortable because it was a program that was not just brought forward by the Ministry of Health, it was supported by Corrections, Police, MSD and the local Hawke's Bay Police. And they, of course, would know more of the program because it was trialled for a short period in 2020. And I place weight on the local police officers' views.
Minister,
Yeah, Jason. And then I'll come back to you, Jessica.
In an April cabinet paper about the situation evolving in Fiji, the COVID situation at the time, a paragraph said, without large amounts of external financial support, there is a real potential for major economic and a fiscal crisis in the country. The government has given $40 million since then, but is there scope for the government to give more, given the fact that the situation has gotten much, much worse since then?
And much of, our support, of course, is about supporting the response of our region to COVID-19 to try and prevent some of those economic impacts. But I've spoken twice, as I've mentioned, with the Prime Minister of Fiji since things have escalated. And the offer that I've made is just for the government there to stay in touch with us on what additional need might exist. He, at that point, was very focused on the vaccination rollout. And so that's where I've again checked in on whether or not the supply we've offered and that Australia is currently actively supplying is sufficient, but also on PPE or personnel. It's a live and ongoing offer. It only will take a phone call to us for us to try and support Fiji in any way we can.
So are you ruling out more financial support at this stage?
No, I'm not ruling that out. I'm not ruling anything out. They're our neighbour, they're our friend, and they're in an incredibly difficult position. But it is for them to make decisions over what will make the most meaningful difference for them. At this stage, it is their vaccine rollout, and they know we're actively working with them on it.
Prime Minister, on these 3 Vietnam War veterans, you've made the ruling not to award them a medal. Can you explain why, and whether you would think about doing something like writing a letter to recognise the military?
So when it comes to the honours system, There is a general approach in the honours system that for these particular types of awards, because they rely on the testimony of those involved, they tend to be awarded within a 5-year period. And the practice has been not to go back retrospectively and make additional orders because of the difficulty in trying to get that first-hand account for those kinds of awards. I was, however, willing to go back and look at these particular circumstances because my concern was, knowing the history within New Zealand of the way that our veterans from that particular conflict were received, I wanted to check that we had not seen a situation where those involved in Vietnam received less recognition than other theatres of war. Having gone back and asked that question, it does appear that actually our treatment seems to be fairly consistent with these kinds of awards across Vietnam relative to others. So having received that assurance, that then I think gives cause for me to stick with the general practice that we have. That doesn't remove my ability to look at other ways to recognise what may have happened. And so I won't rule out looking at alternatives, but when it comes to the honours system, that decision's being made.
How does it sit with you that Australia has recognised them and we are yet to do so? And would you look at doing something like writing a letter, for example?
Yeah, so there are other options that exist. I'm very mindful that when I take on this job, I do take on a history and practice that goes beyond just one term of office, and that if we unpick one decision, we can unpick many. But I did want to go back and check for myself that there had been fairness given the history with the Vietnam War. And I'm satisfied that I've given that consideration now. But I will look at whether or not there are alternatives outside of that formal honours process.
Last Friday, Scott Morrison said he secured a surge in Pfizer vaccines. If that's possible, why doesn't New Zealand do that, given New Zealand's just equally susceptible to true outbreaks, as we've seen now in Australia last month?
To be honest, Ben, I haven't actually been able to particularly decipher through some of the reporting on that because I saw Pfizer then put out a statement, so I don't think I want to get drawn into what exactly has happened with their contractual arrangements. They're for them. What is different for New Zealand is that we've secured enough for New Zealand's population this year and for all of our population this year. And as we've said, by October, we have those deliveries that will make it possible for every New Zealander to access a vaccine. And of course, then it's a matter of moving people through the system across that timeframe.
Use of MIQ to bring home people from Australia delay the reunification of stranded families?
No. And this is a point and I'll hand over to Ms to speak to this a little bit as well. This is a point I was at pains to make this morning. These are not a group of people who will be in competition for others for MIQ spaces. When we made the decision on the Trans-Tasman arrangements, we put aside contingency. That is part of the contingency that we've always had within MIQ. The fact we are now using it does put pressure on other things that we do, like cohorting, like if we need for any reason to shut down a facility, if we have an emergency situation that requires us to move people, it reduces our bandwidth there, but it doesn't mean we're taking rooms that otherwise might be taken from returning New Zealanders from other parts of the world.
Yeah, so we have a short-term opportunity to free up 1,000 rooms in the next fortnight. After the next fortnight, we go back down probably to more like 500 rooms for the Trans-Tasman contingency. The extra 500 rooms we've managed to achieve through a combination of not doing some maintenance on some facilities that were going to be taken out of circulation, so keeping them in the MIQ system instead of temporarily removing them while some maintenance work was done. Also, the changes to the way we do cohorting, so just being a little more relaxed about the strict cohorting rules we've got while we're dealing with this, what is ultimately an emergency situation, in order to free up those additional rooms. Bearing in mind that cohorting is only recent and we were very successful in containing COVID-19 without it, but it's an extra layer of protection that we would like to get back to as quickly as we can. So we can do 1,000 rooms over the next fortnight. It will then be something closer to 500 rooms for Trans-Tasman beyond that, for as long as we need to do that in order to provide people with a pathway home.
By relaxing cohorting and bringing back 1,000 people from what is a COVID hotspot, are you increasing the risk to New Zealand through relaxing it?
As I said, we contained the risk within our facilities very effectively before we introduced cohorting. Cohorting provided an additional level of protection, which we would like to be able to get back to having. But in an emergency situation, you do have to reassess and work with the possible. And one of the things that we were able to do here is free up some more space to bring back people who have already been stranded in New South Wales for some time.
Keep in mind the other protections that we've also added, such as the high-risk country strategy to reduce down the number of people coming in from those very high-risk departure points as well. So there have been other additional things we've added to give that extra layer of protection.
And just on expanding the mandatory border order, so the ports have indicated that there is a lot of hesitancy there, and some people in highly skilled, very specialised jobs are among them. Are you prepared to give exemptions for the ports to bring in people to fill those roles if the people in them don't want to be vaccinated?
And this is again why we've given a bit of lead-in time here, because we do recognise that there may be hesitancy amongst those who are in key roles that may affect some of the operational or present logistical challenges for our ports. We want to work alongside them. We found that actually where we had hesitancy in the last workforce we had an order over, that by providing the opportunity to speak directly to experts, which we did, made a significant difference. We'll do the same with our port workers and work with them if there are, after that, ongoing issues around the skills they need to keep their ports operating.
One of the reasons for the lead time is for those groups where there is a higher degree of hesitancy and a higher degree of misinformation. It is a more intensive exercise to provide them with that information, that kind of one-on-one, if you like, discussion. Generally, when that has happened, though, their hesitancy has fallen away and they've been willing to voluntarily get the vaccination.
Keep in mind, this is a big step for us. We're now moving into a workforce that are not directly employed by the government. So that is why we've considered this deeply as ministers before moving into this space, because it is a big step, but one we believe will enhance the safety of those workers in New Zealand.
How many IQ spaces and tickets are available, like for tomorrow, for people coming back from New South Wales?
So they are spread across the course of the fortnight. The numbers are, relatively modest in those first few days. Forgive me, I don't know, but it is 1,000 across the course of a 2-week period. Keeping in mind, we've been indicated that actually a number of those who are booked are couples, so we'll have more people than necessarily the rooms indicate being able to come home.
One of the bits of complexity we have to deal with here is we don't quite know how the number of people coming in is going to match up with the number of rooms. So we'll keep that under review, and if we find that there are more couples, for example, more families, and therefore less room usage, we will be able to go back to the airlines and allow them to bring more people in. Now, across the 2-week period, it's about 650, I think, in the first week and about 350 in the second week. And then beyond that, we'd then move to something that's more like about 500 across a fortnight.
We've had to apportion those across the 2 airlines who will be operating based on the demand that they had before the closure.
Yeah, I should probably just add for clarity too that the 80-20 split that we talked about, so 80% is demand, 20% is allocation. That's averaged out across the week because there'll be a little bit of unders and overs on particular flights.
Your Labour leader hat on. Were you disappointed that were you disappointed that Melissa Wall was not able to speak during the mental health debate last week? And in her role as a Labour Party MP and had to take a National Party slot.
Well, actually,
ministers were prioritised, and that's why she did get priority. Why was Kirsty Allen given a slot and not her?
So the first point I'd make is actually by the time I became aware of the issue, actually everyone who wanted to speak was speaking. And given that this was really a debate that was off the back of cross-party work, I have no issue that there were cross-party slots being shared at all. In fact, I've said many times before that this is one issue that I hope we can depoliticise of the many issues we debate in this place. When it comes to who was speaking, you had ministers that were involved from a youth affairs perspective, from a health perspective. For Minister Allen, of course, she has just returned to Parliament. This was an opportunity for her to speak on an issue that she felt passionately about as an individual MP, but also as a member of our cabinet and having recently returned. We also had, for instance, an exception to the Minister, Kieran McAnulty, speaking with a particular view of rural communities. opportunities. And, of course, Lewis Award did have an opportunity as well.
Felt that Lewis Award was fit to be a cabinet minister?
Oh, look, there's obviously a significant number of MPs who are not because of skill set, but just simply the number that are available to take up those roles who are not ministers. And as I'd say, there are many more people in our caucus generally who have the skills and ability generally to be ministers who are not, because we only have 20 of them. Sorry? Ultimately, these are decisions that are actually made by local membership, not by me as party leader. At a local level, our members determine who will locally represent them. Yeah.
She being punished
on
for speaking
Friday,
out China.
farmers are planning protests in around 50 protests. Federated Farmers President Andrew Hoggard today says he's not surprised because of frustration and anger about the deluge of new regulation and costs from central government that is now spilling over into protest meetings. Do the farmers have a point?
Oh, there is no question that we as a country, and then by virtue of that, our primary sector, are facing significant challenges. They include everything from how we transition in the face of climate change, how we make sure that we reverse some of the degradation of our waterways together, and there is no doubt that our primary sector sits at the forefront of how we resolve those issues together. So I'm not denying they are big challenges for us. We've been very committed and focused on how we can address those together. I sit down regularly with our food and fibre sector leaders talking about the solutions that we need to generate. For climate change, we've taken, I think, a world-leading approach of working together with our primary sector on the solution there, and they're very much being a part of designing our solutions. But there's no question, there's a lot of pressure on all of us, but on particular our primary sector.
Are you sort of saying that you can almost understand why they might be protesting on Friday?
No, look, I'm saying that I'm of course aware of the challenges that we face, but my view is that to delay them, to postpone them, or to not take action would be more damaging. We trade on our brand. When we enter into trade negotiations, the questions that we face are very much about issues such as our contribution to climate change, the most significant of which, unfortunately, comes through our food production. We face questions on what we're doing to protect our waterways and the role that we're playing generally in upholding environmental standards. If we cannot answer those questions or deal with them appropriately, we will devalue our products on the world stage, and that's bad for all of us. So yes, there's a lot of pressure on all of us, but if we delay or don't take action, we will be worse off.
In March,
I said the last couple, I think. So I'll go Thomas and then Mark.
In March, Minister Woods said that there was a lack of foreign investment in the build-to-rent space and sort of conceded that there was a perception issue there in attracting that investment. Today, ACT has come out with a policy to legislatively clarify that problem to attract foreign investment into build-to-rent developments. Is that something, would you ever go that far as to clarify legislation or use other sort of measures to...
Look, that's not something I'm going to make comment on today. That's not something that Cabinet's had a substantive discussion on. Of course, it is fair to say that in New Zealand, build-to-rent is a sector where we're seeing the beginnings of some new models that are worth us exploring, but we've not had any discussion on at this stage or decisions made on foreign direct investment in that regard.
Problem that we're struggling to attract this investment?
We have a housing problem generally. We have an affordable rent problem. We need to continue to address both of those issues, but do it within a principled framework that New Zealand will be comfortable with. Yeah.
Do you have any updates on the mandatory sort of contact tracing or checking in and the expansion of masks, which would go to Cabinet?
So Cabinet had another discussion today. I'll get Minister Hipkins to actually finish up on this note. We had another discussion today. And we're quite clear on what we want to achieve with these measures. Firstly, when we're not in a crisis situation, we want to be prepared for one by identifying those high-risk environments and make sure we're acting appropriately in case a case is identified. And then phase two is making sure that if we have a case, we then respond quickly with the kinds of mitigations like face masks that are appropriate. In wanting to take those decisions, there's a lot of advice we have to receive, including enforcement, who's responsible for enforcing it, and particularly privacy concerns. It's fair to say there are different views across different agencies, and also we're engaging with the Privacy Commissioner. It's not straightforward, so we continue to work through some of those challenges.
I think if it comes to mask use, I think at alert levels, at higher alert levels, we will almost certainly have much wider requirements around mask use at alert level 2 and above in the future, and we're finalising what that looks like at the moment. In terms of enforcement, of course, that's relatively straightforward. Someone's wearing a mask or they're not, and you can see whether they're wearing a mask or not. In terms of scanning in or keeping a contact tracing record, that's more difficult, because if someone contests that they have, made a record of where they have been, and there's some question about that, the only way to verify that is then, of course, to delve into their private information. And so those are the sorts of issues that we just have to work our way through.
Is there a view towards the possibility of updating the app so you would be able to show, that your last signed in location without the rest of your history being revealed?
So look, we haven't looked at all of that yet, but those are the sorts of things that we'll work our way through.
All right, thank you very much for that.